If you have your Bibles, go ahead and open up to the book of Joshua and uh, kind of set up for you what has happened up to this point in the book of Joshua. We're at the end of the book of Joshua, and they have conquered all these cities. And as they conquered these cities, half the tribe of Manasseh and Gad, they decided that, this side of the river, this is a good place, right? So they decided, these 2.5 tribes, they decided, we're going to stay here. And then Joshua said, that's fine, but your men are coming with us. So the men of those 2.5 tribes, they traveled with the Israelites, and they continued conquering the rest of the land. And then once all the conquering was done, and the Lord had successfully delivered the land of Canaan into their hands, these 2.5 tribes, all these men returned back to their house, to their homes, to this place across the river where they had already decided that they were going to live. And that's where we are. And I've debated on what to do. But what we're going to do, as I've decided, is we're going to read a lot. Because this sets up for us, and there's not really a part that we can leave out. It sets up for us what we're talking about, because what happens in Joshua chapter 22 is almost a civil war. Before the Israelites ever settle down in Canaan, a civil war almost breaks out. And it is a pivotal moment, in my opinion, a pivotal moment in the Israelite history that sometimes gets overlooked. So what we're going to do, you're just going to have to hang with me. We're going to begin reading in verse 10, and we're going to read almost the rest of the chapter. We're going to read into verse 29, okay? And this is going to set up for us some of these lessons, definite applications for our life today. But read with me Joshua chapter 22, beginning in verse 10. All right, and just hang with me and try to pay attention best you can. When they came to the region of the Jordan, that is, in the land of Canaan, the people of Reuben and the people of Gad and the half tribe of Manasseh built there an altar by the Jordan, an altar of imposing size. And the people of Israel heard it, said, "Behold, the people of Reuben and the people of Gad and the half tribe of Manasseh have built an altar at the frontier of the land of Canaan, in the region about the Jordan, on the side that belongs to the people of Israel." And when the people of Israel heard of it, the whole assembly of the people of Israel gathered at Shiloh to make war against them. Then the people of Israel sent to the people of Reuben, the people of Gad, and the half tribe of Manasseh in the land of Gilead Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the priest, and with him 10 chiefs, one from each of the tribal families of Israel, every one of them the head of a family among the clans of Israel. And they came to the people of Reuben, the people of Gad, and the half tribe of Manasseh in the land of Gilead. And they said to them, "Thus says the whole congregation of the Lord, what is this breach of faith that you have committed against the God of Israel, and turning away this day from following the Lord by building yourselves an altar this day in rebellion against the Lord? Have we not had enough of the sin at Peor, from which even yet we have not cleansed ourselves, and for which there came a plague upon the congregation of the Lord, that you too must turn away this day from following the Lord? And if you too rebel against the Lord today, then tomorrow he will be angry with the whole congregation of Israel. But now, if the land of your possession is unclean, pass over into the Lord's land, where the Lord's tabernacle stands, and take for yourselves a possession among us. Only do not rebel against the Lord, or make us as rebels by building for yourselves an altar other than the altar of the Lord our God. Did not Achan, the son of Zerah, break faith in the matter of the devoted things, and wrath fell upon all the congregation of Israel, and he did not perish alone for his iniquity? Then the people of Reuben, the people of Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh said in answer to the heads of the families of Israel, the mighty one, the God, the Lord, the mighty one, God, the Lord, he knows. And let Israel itself know if it was in rebellion or in breach of faith against the Lord. Do not spare us today for building an altar to turn away from following the Lord, or if we did so to offer burnt offerings or grain offerings or peace offerings on it. May the Lord himself take vengeance. No, but we did it from fear, that in time to come your children might say to our children, what we, that we, no, excuse me. What have you to do with the Lord, the God of Israel? For the Lord, verse 25, for the Lord has made the Jordan a boundary between us and you people of Reuben and the people of Gad. You have no portion in the Lord. So your children might make our children cease to worship the Lord. Therefore, we said, let us now build an altar, not for burnt offering, nor for sacrifice, but as a witness between us and you, and between our generations after us, that we do perform the service of the Lord in his presence with our burnt offerings and sacrifices and peace offerings. So your children will not say to our children in time to come, you have no portion in the Lord. And we thought, if this should be said to us or to our descendants in time to come, we should say, behold, the copy of the altar of the Lord, which our fathers made, not for burnt offerings, not for sacrifice, but to be a witness between us and you. Far be it from us that we should rebel against the Lord and turn away this day from following the Lord by building an altar for burnt offering, grain offering, or sacrifice other than the altar of the Lord our God that stands before his tabernacle. All right, again, lengthy, but what it does, it sets up for us this pivotal conversation that took place in Israelite history that nearly cost Israel, all of Israel, its inheritance. It nearly cost Abraham the promise. It's an almost war because they almost had war with each other. And it all is because of this altar that the half-tribe of Manasseh, Gad, and Reuben built on the side of the other side of the river. Not their side, the other side of the river. So what are some lessons this week? Been thinking a lot. What are some lessons that we can learn? And I think there is a plethora. I think there is an abundance of lessons that we can learn from this, especially pertaining to godly living. You know, what we do and how we live and what our lives are like. Godly living is at stake, and we have several examples of what godly living ought to be like. For instance, you see in verse 16, godly living that we need to judge after we ask questions. You got to ask questions. Ask before you start judging someone. Have you ever seen someone doing something and you're like, can you believe it? I can't even imagine that person would do something like that. Let me give you an example. There is was a professor at Freed-Hardeman. Oh, Freed-Hardeman, right? There was a professor at Freed-Hardeman, that well-respected Bible professor, that was told by his doctor that he needed some antioxidants in his system. So this particular Bible professor would once a month go to the liquor store and come out with a bottle of wine. Now, I can't imagine all the judgment that would go on, but it was, according to the doctor, his prescription. Ask before you judge. Now, you may still, I don't think that's probably the smartest thing to do. I don't think it's a wise decision, but it's important for us to ask before we judge. You remember Matthew chapter 7? Judge not, that you be not judged. In verse 2, with the judgment that you use, it will be used against you. So if you want to be judged harshly, be harsh. If you want to be judged graciously and generously, be gracious and generous. Or for instance, John chapter 7 in verse 24, you remember what Jesus says there? There's a way to judge rightly. And I think the way that we judge rightly is we don't judge before we get to the bottom of it. Ask questions before you judge. Let's read that real quick together. John chapter 7, verse 24. Do not judge by appearances, but judge with right judgment. It's very easy for us to take a superficial gaze at someone and to come to a judgmental conclusion, a condemning conclusion. It's very easy to do. But don't judge by appearances, but judge with, Jesus says, right judgment. There's a way that it needs to be done, and I believe asking before we jump to any conclusions is probably one way that it's done. You go back to the text in Joshua chapter 22, and I think another part of godly living that's demonstrated here is found in verse 19. In Joshua chapter 22 and verse 19, they offer a solution. You see someone struggling with sin. You see someone that is deeply involved in a horrible situation, and before you begin condemning them, offer them a way out, right? And what they did here, verse 19, but now if the land of your possession is unclean, pass over into the Lord's land, where the Lord's tabernacle stands, and take for yourselves a possession among us. Only do not rebel against the Lord or make us as rebels by building for yourselves an altar other than the altar of the Lord our God. If that's a bad land, if you don't want that land anymore, come be a part of this side of the river, right? Offer a solution to someone who's struggling with sin. It's very important for us that, yes, we judge with right judgment, but if there is anything that we can do to help someone out of sin, that we try our best to do that. I think another thing that we see is that your intentions, your motivation, it matters. Your intentions matter. Because this isn't the only time that an altar has been built on the frontier of a land. You remember? In 2 Kings, 1 Kings, rather, maybe 1 Kings. There was, 1 Kings, there was a man by the name of Jeroboam that became king. You remember him? Jeroboam became king, and what he decided to do was to build an altar, much like this altar. And he built one on the northern end of the kingdom was divided after Solomon, Jeroboam, and Rehoboam. On the northern end of his kingdom and on the southern end of his kingdom. So the people of his northern kingdom would be able to go wherever they would want to worship God. You could go to the north and worship. You could go to the south and worship God. But the intention, go back and look at this with me real quick. The intention was completely different. Because along with these altars, he also built calves made out of gold. And look at what he says here in 1 Kings chapter 12, beginning in verse 28. So the king took counsel and made 2 calves of gold, and he said to the people, look at this. You have gone up to Jerusalem long enough. Looking at these calves, behold your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. And he set one in Bethel and the other he put in Dan. Intentions matter. You continue reading, and this was the instance that the northern kingdom began being led away from God. Your intentions, they matter. I also think if we go back and we think about this and put it in perspective in Joshua chapter 22, now what the half tribe of Manasseh, Gad and Reuben, what these tribes accomplished and their intention, it's admirable. I personally think it's very admirable once they define, elaborate a little bit what they were trying to accomplish. Because what they had in mind was a godly heritage. They wanted to make sure that their children were worshiping God. And they wanted to make sure that the children of Israel's did not dispossess them from worshiping God. So they created this altar in verse 12 of imposing size. But think about that idea of creating, maintaining, and working towards a godly heritage. Because what that means is, what they have said in verse 27 is that there is a need to remember. If you want your children and your children's children and your great-grandchildren to know about God, we need them to remember. We need them to remember God. We need them to remember all the things that God has done. We need them to remember God's people, God's church, so on and so forth. In verse 27, this is what they said several times, but for instance, look at verse 27. But to be a witness between us and you, between our generations after us, that we do perform the service of the Lord in His presence with our burnt offerings and sacrifices and peace offerings. So your children will not say to our children in time to come, you have no portion in the Lord. If you want to establish a godly heritage, you need to remember. It's easy. It's very easy to forget. A generation away from an event, it's very easy to forget. We are a generation and a half away from a very significant event in U.S. history. If I say December 7th, 1941, raise your hands if you know what I'm talking about. A lot of older people. Yeah, I remember. Many of us young people, we don't even remember December 7th, 1941, the day Pearl Harbor was bombed. It's easy to forget. A generation removed, it's easy to forget. Our children, our grandchildren, they might not remember the date 9/11. They might not be able to remember Twin Towers or I think it was the Pentagon. A generation, it is important to establish the memory of our children if we want to perpetuate a godly heritage. And this is exactly what they were trying to do. I think they were also trying to establish this idea that we have to, if we want to establish a godly heritage, we have to take opportunities to teach our children. Because you see in verse 27, they established this, they built this altar in verse 12 of imposing size so that it would be in people's faces. And people would ask, What is this? And that would be a teaching opportunity. This altar, it wasn't for any worship purposes, but it was for a teaching opportunity. What is that? What is that giant pile of stones over there? Let me tell you, son. We worship God. That's what that's about. We worship God, and you look over there on that side of the river, they worship God too. That's what it's for. It's important for us to perpetuate this godly heritage, to teach our children. I love Deuteronomy chapter 4. Look at what it says here in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 19. Verse 5, 9. There we are. Yes. Only take care and keep your soul diligently, lest you forget the things that your eyes have seen, unless they depart from your heart all the days of your life. Make them known, here it is, make them known to your children and your children's children. Be careful unless you forget. Pause with me very quickly. Do you remember the context of Deuteronomy in which it's written? Deuteronomy is literally second giving of the law. It's the second giving of the law. This was the time after the wilderness wanderings. How long did they wander in the wilderness? 40 years, John. They wandered in the wilderness 40 years. What happened as they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years? Everybody died. 20 years and older, everybody died. You know what that means? We are a generation removed from the Exodus. And then he says this, take care and keep your soul diligently, lest you forget. You got to teach it to your children. You got to teach it to your children's children. If you want this godly heritage, if you want to remember God, be diligent about teaching. And that's what, going back to Joshua chapter 22, that's what it was all about. It was a teaching opportunity for our children and our children's children and those to come. We also find out in this particular text, we find out a lot about God, about godly living, about a godly heritage, but maybe most we find out about God above all. We see that God sees and knows everything in verse 22. This is how, after this accusation, what have you done in building this altar? Just come up and worship at the altar in front of the tabernacle. How dare you do this? This is their response in verse 22. Half tribe of Manasseh, Gad, and Reuben. They say, the mighty one God, the Lord, the mighty one God, the Lord, He knows. And let Israel itself know. God knows. There's lesson number one about God. God knows and God sees everything. God knows. God, the Lord, our God, the God of Israel. He knows. Now, to many people, that's a very encouraging thought. To the half tribe of Manasseh, to Gad and Reuben, this was incredibly encouraging because God already knew their intentions. God knew their heart. God knew that they were trying to perpetuate this godly heritage. But for some people, that could be very scary, couldn't it? To know that God knows everything, to know that God sees even what's inside of your heart, that could be a very scary thought, couldn't it? So we find out here that God knows and God sees even what's going on the inside. Gad and Reuben, and the half tribe of Manasseh also make allusion to the fact that sin is going to be punished, that God is going to take care of sin. They even say to them about themselves, well, let's just read it, verse 22 and verse 23. The mighty one, the God, the Lord, the mighty one, God, the Lord, he knows, and let Israel itself know. If it was in rebellion or in breach of faith against the Lord, do not spare us today for building an altar to turn away from following the Lord. Or if we did so to offer burnt offerings or grain offerings or peace offerings on it, may the Lord himself take vengeance. You take vengeance on us. And if it was in rebellion, let the Lord take vengeance on us. Sin's going to be punished. God knows and God sees everything. And God's not going to let sin go unpunished. Sin must be reckoned with. I think one thing for me, which all of this is kind of about, is that God and worshiping God, it doesn't depend on the river, right? Because there was this river of Jordan that separated the half tribe of Manasseh, Gad, and Reuben from the rest. But God doesn't see the river. God didn't see the river because everybody worshiped God. Wasn't that what it was all about? This was for us to remember that for our children to remember that we serve the Lord, and your children to never disregard our children or dispatch them from serving the Lord. This was so we can all serve the Lord, because God doesn't see any physical barriers between us and you. God doesn't see the river. We might translate that. God doesn't see the train tracks, right? You're on the wrong side of the train tracks. You know, that's where you're from. God doesn't see the train tracks, does he? You're not really you're not a real Christian. I mean, you don't give as much as I do. We see a wealthy man come in and we welcome him, but we see a poor man come in and ratty clothes, and we kind of, snub our. Did he even bathe today? Does it matter? God doesn't see the train tracks. Paul comes into the city of Athens, and he's prompted, he's motivated. I suppose the spirit in him is stirred up, and he goes into this open area, and he called the Areopagus, and he begins talking to them, and he says, I want to talk to you about this unknown God. You remember the story. And as he's talking to them, he says in Acts chapter 17 and verse 30, you recall, he says, times of ignorance God overlooked, but now commands all men everywhere to repent. Who's included? All men everywhere. Isn't that everybody? Because God doesn't see the train tracks. Here is Paul, a Jew, in one of the most prominent Greek cities that has ever existed. And he's saying, guys, you need to come to God. God doesn't see the train tracks. God doesn't see the river. I think we also notice in verse 12 that your relationship with God is worth standing up for. That's what I want to leave you with. Because God is worth standing up for. When you go through today, this week, next month or so, remember that your relationship with God is worth standing up for. They heard that as they were leaving this half tribe and Gad and Reuben, they built an altar. And it stirred them up deeply. And they came out against them, it says, to make war against them. Think about that. Here is these thousands of men that have been fighting side by side with us all this time, and now we're ready to kill them. We're ready to get rid of them because they aren't worshiping God. At least that's what they thought until we cleared the air, right? But here's the point, that God is worth standing up for. Your relationship with God is worth fighting for. Sometimes that may be what it comes down to. Because the truth is that we're not almost at war. We are at war. We're at war with the devil and his schemes and all those fiery darts that he's aiming at us all the time. But your relationship with God is worth fighting for. God is worth fighting for. Remain steadfast until the end. Remain immovable, and I will give you a crown of life. Maybe your faith has been shaken. Maybe you need just a little bit of encouragement in your fight, in your war against Satan. If we can help you in any way, I want to encourage you to come as we stand and as we sing.